Hey there, welcome to dotnetFlix. Today our guest is Sander and Brinke. And Sander, we're going to talk about OpenAPI spec, right?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. Hi.
Awesome. So OpenAPI spec, I understood we cannot call it Swagger anymore. But I just wanted to drop that term to make sure that people that know it by that name also are interested in this video. But you're going to tell us all about it. So I would say the floor is yours and show us all about OpenAPI spec.
Sure thing. So first, let me just introduce myself a little bit for people that don't know me. So my name, like you said, is Sander Brinke. I live here in the Netherlands, and I met you excellent people at BitBash, where I actually also talked about this, so OpenAPI, but specifically OpenAPI in .NET and .NET 9 and what's going to be coming in .NET 10 as well. So I'm a senior software engineer at Arcady for consultancy. I do a lot of .NET. I do a lot of Azure. I do basically a DevOps as well. I do everything except for CSS is what I always tell people. Don't ask me to do CSS.
That's a good life choice, I guess.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
You gotta have some boundaries, right?
Exactly. So for the rest, what I'm doing as well, I do a lot of stuff like this, right? So like speaking, blogging, podcasting, open source as well. So I'm a Microsoft MVP. I think you guys are both MVPs as well, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, you're gonna get why this is so much fun and everything. And yeah, I've been really interested in kind of OpenAPI for a while now, especially for like API client generation and that kind of thing. It just clicked for me. It's like I always want to use this, so I try to learn more and more about OpenAPI, and here we are.
Cool.
So yeah, I would like today to talk to you about OpenAPI, about .NET 9, about the changes, the breaking changes. Should you migrate? Should you not? And kind of curious what you guys think as well.
Yeah, and so just to be sure, it is not a .NET thing, right? OpenAPI spec is open.
That's a great question.
You can use it from any programming language, but there are tools that you can use from .NET for working with OpenAPI spec, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Exactly. So OpenAPI, like I'll show you in a little bit as well. But OpenAPI exactly is an open standard, right? It's just a way to describe an API. You can use this in any language, like tons of of course, some languages will be more popular than others, but exactly, it's just something you can use in any language. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Let me just quickly switch to some slides, and after that, I'm gonna try to be very code and demo heavy because that's fun.
Awesome.
So let me just take a second here. Let me just switch you guys over here. Okay, yeah, feel free to share my screen. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, so like I said, I just want to have a few slides, kind of get you started, and afterwards we're gonna go ahead and go do some demos. So for the people here that might not be familiar with OpenAPI, or for the audience, so OpenAPI is a standard for designing, for building and documenting APIs. And you might be thinking, like, so why is that actually useful? That's because implementing and building API can be quite complex. And in this case, we're going to be talking a lot about HTTP APIs. So there's things, like get, post, put, that kind of stuff, all the methods. There's your request body, your response body, the URI. There's the headers, there's authorization and authentication, and there's things like cookies and all kinds of different things, XML, JSON. Nowadays, it's quite simple to make them, but there's still a lot of stuff going on under the hood. So that's why something like OpenAPI exists, where we can simply describe the way an API works. And by doing so, we get a whole lot of benefits. So you guys can see this on the screen, right? You're familiar with this thing called Swagger UI?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah,
exactly. So the cool thing about OpenAPI here is that OpenAPI is it's like an open protocol, open description and specification, like Edwin already called it. So on the left, we see a little bit of a bit of text, a YAML as well. And you can use this OpenAPI specification as an input for loads of different tools. For example, for Swagger UI, which I think is probably the most well-known OpenAPI tool, I guess.
Definitely within the .NET ecosystem.
Yeah, that's funny that you say that, because that's going to change. But we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So like you said, it's language agnostic. You can use this wherever you want in any language. And today we're going to talk about .NET. So we talked about Swagger UI, but I quickly want to talk a little bit about other tooling as well, because there's loads of tooling available. So I'm not sure if you guys were familiar, but there's this website called openapi.tools. And on that website, you can find a list of like 350 plus tools that you can use with any OpenAPI document. And we're not going to talk about all of these in the screenshot. I just quickly want to mention a few of them. So, like I already did in the introduction, API client generators for me are the most interesting thing. So we can have an API, and then we want to, of course, have a client as well, like a React or like in a front-end web application like React or Angular or Vue, maybe like a .NET MAUI app, maybe an Android app, maybe another server. And normally what we do is we would just type all the response bodies, the request bodies, the URLs, all the methods, we type them out. And we'd introduce lots of little bugs and issues where we make typos. This can all be prevented by just generating an API client based on an OpenAPI document. And then there's things like documentation. There's things like mock servers. Are you guys maybe familiar with those?
Yeah, a little bit, but I haven't used them quite often yet. But
Same here, yeah.
Okay, so like a mock server, what that basically is you might be familiar with the problem where you're working like on a front-end application, and then you, need to implement something in the backend. So we're making like a list page, right, of to-dos. Let's just say something simple like that. And now we need to call an API, but the API is not done. So we're just imagining probably has a title, a description, maybe a state, some other things. And then we're just creating some mock data. And at some point, the API is done. So now we can throw away all that code, and now we have to implement the API. And you're going to encounter some bugs where the API works differently. So you have to change your logic around. It's kind of painful. So a mock server, what it allows you to do is it allows you to run a fake server in your terminal based on an OpenAPI specification. So now what you can do is you can basically talk to your teammates like, hey, you're going to work on the API part for the to-do list, right? Yeah, I'm going to work on that. Great. Could you maybe already like define the OpenAPI documents, or at least create a little body so I can generate an OpenAPI document, and then I can run a fake server, and then at some point when the server is done, we can just switch out the URL to my terminal to the actual server, and everything will work. It's something I don't see a lot of people doing, but I think it's a really, really useful thing.
Yeah, and is it also possible then to maybe influence the behavior of the mock based on the request, something that's in the request, for instance, or doesn't it have that kind of functionality?
It does actually. So I know that you can use the OpenAPI's example property to kind of feed it what kind of data it wants. I feel like I remember some blog post from another Dutch MVP. I forget his name. It's really bad for me. I'm sorry. But I think it might have been around this kind of thing and like using some AI as well to generate more data.
Yeah.
So that if that doesn't exist, it should, because it's really, really useful.
That would be really powerful. Yeah.
Exactly. Cool. So then it's just a question of integrating this into your, into your development environment, but it has a lot of benefits. And then there's things like API testing. For example, you can input in Postman an OpenAPI spec, and it'll generate a whole Postman collection based on that, and lots of other testing tools as well.
Nice.
Exactly. So if you want to learn more, especially about API client generation, you see a QR code there. You can find it on my website, where I wrote a blog post all about how that works in .NET and how you can go from zero to getting an actual pipeline where API clients are generated and all that kind of thing. So feel free to take a look at that.
Nice.
So next, I want to talk a little bit about, what happens currently in .NET in regards to like OpenAPI, and what is going to be happening, now in .NET 9 and the future. So you might be familiar with a package called like Swashbuckle, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So what happens in .NET like in .NET 8 is there's the ASP.NET Core bit, and then there's the third-party library bit. So ASP.NET Core has something called an API Explorer, which is kind of an abstraction on top of all of your endpoints. So the API Explorer collects when your application starts all of your actions, your controller actions, your minimal API things, and then it kind of resembles that in some metadata. Like we have these routes available, and third-party libraries like Swashbuckle, NSwag, that kind of thing. They use that metadata, and then maybe have some of their own transformers that you can define library-specific ones, and they will create the OpenAPI document for you. So ASP.NET Core has basically zero knowledge of OpenAPI. So then I can perform a request for an OpenAPI document, but ASP.NET Core is basically not doing anything. It's just all done by the third-party libraries, and the same thing for Swagger UI. And this worked, but there have been some issues in the last few years. There's always been a little bit of a disconnect between how the API Explorer worked and how OpenAPI worked, because this was maintained by the community. So there were sometimes a couple of little bugs, and then that had to be fixed by the community. And then there was also the issue that Swashbuckle has basically been like unmaintained for the last 4 years. Like since last year, they got some new maintainers, like Martin Costello is one. He's a really amazing guy. And he has now, picked up the work and started merging new PRs. But it was basically a dead project that got included in any .NET project that you would create. And Microsoft wasn't really sure about that anymore. So what they then decided to do is in .NET 9 to remove Swashbuckle as a dependency and introduce their own package. So Microsoft created Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.OpenAPI. And with this package, it replaces almost all the functionality from third-party libraries, but now with Microsoft first-party support and some really cool new additions as well. So now what you can see is ASP.NET Core is now able to collect all this metadata, apply OpenAPI Transformers, and create OpenAPI documents for you. The only thing that we would still need third-party libraries for is to render Swagger UI. And that is basically one of the big breaking changes. Swagger UI is no longer included by default.
Okay.
It is simple to get back, right? It's really easy to install the same package again or include it in other ways, but it is something that Microsoft decided to not include anymore in their own library.
And Sander, is the other part, is that a drop-in replacement, or do you need some work in your code base to step to this one, to go to this new library from Microsoft?
Right. So if you want to migrate, for example, from Swashbuckle or
for instance,
the better one and Swag to the new one. So it's, if you didn't really have any custom OpenAPI logic, it's a drop-in replacement.
Okay.
If you had some custom like schema transformers, I'm not really sure anymore how Swashbuckle calls them now on top of my head. But if you had custom logic, OpenAPI related logic, you'll have to translate that, but it's quite simple. It's all very similar. So it is not that difficult. You will notice some behavioral changes. I would say, for most part, better. Like it's more sane defaults that Microsoft includes.
Okay.
But yeah,
it's good to know.
Exactly.
So I'm looking forward to .NET 10, Sander. Do you know if there are any plans to include a UI, or are they just sticking with Swagger UI?
Yeah. So no, there's. So what do you mean with sticking with Swagger UI?
Now, as you said, Swag UI, you now must add yourself, so there's no default UI out of the box experience.
Exactly.
So do you know if there are any plans to create a Microsoft built UI experience out of the box to ship in later .NET versions?
As far as I know, I talked to the team about this as well, and as far as I know at this moment, no, they're not planning on doing that.
Okay.
Their reasoning for this as well is there are some security issues around Swashbuckle if you're using it for like authentication and authorization. Like if you're using like the tokens and like client credentials and that kind of stuff, they could kind of be badly stored or badly used. And that's one of the things where Microsoft was like, do we really want to ship this to all our customers?
Yeah,
then the second option was
the default template. Yeah,
exactly. And then the second option was, okay, well, we could maybe fix it and then ship it into our API projects, but then they would need to include like web assets in their API projects, which they would also be like, we need to maintain that.
Yeah.
Or they would need to include like the raw files or their own builds, but then they would need to constantly keep that updated against the upstream. And that was also something they were like not currently willing to maintain.
Yeah, and you cannot help them with the CSS, so that wouldn't be a very good thing to do.
It would be bring your own CSS.
Exactly. But funnily enough, the fact that they removed Swagger UI is, to me, is actually a really good thing for the OpenAPI community. We're going to see that in the demo too, because there's now a new kind of OpenAPI UI available called Scalar, and it has loads of features and loads of innovations that you can simply, with one package and one line of code, you can include that into your project instead.
Nice.
And again, otherwise you just install Swashbuckle again and call one line of code, and you got Swagger UI back. It's just, yeah. It is a little inconvenient, but I don't think it's going to affect that many.
And this could be a first step in the migration, and then maybe later on move towards that other tool. So that could be also
exactly right.
Cool.
Okay, so that's basically. Let me switch back to this. Actually, we're going to cover that later. So this is now actually the time where I want to switch to my slide, or to my demo. Excuse me. So, because I'm going to go through a couple of demos and a couple of, examples of what has changed and how it looks like. Okay, so let's take a look at the old version in .NET 8 that most people will probably be familiar with, or .NET 7, or if you're being a very, insecure .NET 6. And let's then take a look at what has changed since .NET 9. All right, so I here have a little repo. You can find it on GitHub, on my GitHub page, and an OpenAPI .NET 9 talk. I think you guys could maybe put like a link in the description or something as well.
Yep.
Yeah, we will.
Awesome. So there's a little code tour in here, and I want to kind of take you through a couple of, a little tour to how this is currently working in .NET 8. So I think you two will probably be familiar with this, where we create a .NET 8 project, which is currently still LTS and completely fine to use. You get Swashbuckle out of the box. And now when you want to add Swashbuckle, it's really simple. We add Endpoints API Explorer, then we add Swagger Gen. And remember, Swagger is basically the old name for OpenAPI.
Yeah.
We always include these exact 3 lines of code to get the XML comment support. And then we call use Swagger for the OpenAPI document, and then use Swagger UI for Swagger UI. And that's all basically you need to get OpenAPI in a .NET application in .NET 8. Okay, so now I want to take you to a little application here, and I'm going to show you some models and some endpoints that we're going to be using in several demos to demonstrate an OpenAPI integration. So here we have a talk model with an ID, a title, some data annotations. So we can say that this title has a min length of 1 and a max length of 500. The length in minutes needs to be between 1 and 640. And the description is the description for the room name. So the name of the room where a talk will take place.
That's a long talk, man, 640 minutes.
It's a very long talk. Let's hope that this recording stays a little bit shorter. All right. So one thing as well, another breaking change that we need to talk about is you might be familiar. Are you guys familiar with the description annotation? Have you ever really used it in ASP.NET Core projects?
No.
Yes, I have, actually.
Really? So, because I would say developers would probably be more familiar with XML comments.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. So that's one change. In .NET, in .NET 9, Microsoft has this new OpenAPI package, but .NET 9 does not support XML comments yet.
Okay.
So if you're currently using XML comments and you want that support in .NET 9, you can install Martin Costello's OpenAPI extensions package. You can install a very shady, like officially Microsoft nightly weird experimental package, or you just wait, or you
ship it to production.
Exactly, just ship it. Right click, deploy. Or you can just wait for .NET 10 because it's already been merged in .NET 10 Preview 1, Preview 2, and this will just be supported in .NET 10 again. But for now, you need to use the description attributes, endpoint summary attributes, etc. All right, so that's one of the models. We can also create a talk in this API. So we can create a title with a string length of a maximum of 1 and a minimum of 100 and a minimum of 1. A length in minutes, again, way too long, good feedback. And the room name. So then, if we live in a landscape, are you guys using like controllers in production, or have you guys already switched to minimal APIs, or does it depend?
For most of my projects, we've switched to minimal APIs.
Really?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So in this presentation, also to cover your use cases, we're going to be talking about controllers, and we're going to be talking about minimal APIs as well, though they're going to be very, very similar.
Okay.
So here we can see some endpoints to manage talks for a conference API, right? So we can get talks, and this returns OK with just a little list of talks. And the interesting part here is we can say produces response type, and so this will return a collection of talk models when status 200 OK is set up.
Mm-hmm.
And this is useful for OpenAPI to understand what each endpoint returns. You don't need to always add this, but I always explicitly do, because it just makes my documents a lot cleaner and easier to understand. Then there's the get talk endpoint, right? So we go to API/talk/ID, and now we can get a specific talk. So this will either return a talk model with 200 OK, or it will return a 404 not found. And here we can say, well, if the talk is null, we return not found. So then there's the next question for you guys. Are you guys maybe familiar with the OpenAPI analyzers in ASP.NET Core?
No.
Doesn't ring a bell.
So this is something I don't see a lot of people using, but it's extremely useful. So what you can say is you always want these to be in sync, right? So you never want to omit one, but you also don't want to add a response type here that is not actually used. So keeping these in sync can be quite challenging, especially over time, and especially if these endpoints get bigger or stuff like that. So what you can do is, if we were to comment this out, you immediately see like a little yellow line here, and that says, hey, this method returns an undeclared status code 404.
Nice.
And this is the only thing you need to do in your CS proj is to include OpenAPI analyzers. I believe that's the actual correct name as well. Yeah, include OpenAPI analyzers.
Oh, cool.
And now this will just work.
This will definitely help.
Exactly. And you can simply go ahead, and what I always do is warning is error, and now this B error will not be able to be merged, and you can ensure that you have correct documents.
Cool.
You need to keep in mind though that if you're using like global exception handlers, this won't help you. But in lots of cases, this would still be useful to turn on.
Yep, definitely.
All right, and then we can also create a talk, and here we see a little bit more of a complicated endpoint, right? So this endpoint will return a 200 OK with a talk model. This will return a 400 bad request, and it will also return a 409 conflict. And that's basically it. So now let's take a look live at the endpoints, right? So here we have Swagger UI. I'm sorry for blinding you. And here we have Swagger UI. And here we can see all of our endpoints that we've defined in .NET 8. So we can get a talk, and we can see here we get some talks back. So we can get an OpenAPI talk, a Dapper talk, a GenAI, managed identities. These were actually all talks featured at BitBash as well.
Yep.
And here we can see the response body. If we were to get a talk by an ID, we can get talk number 2, and that will return the talk about Dapper. We can also try to get talk 76, and then this will return something called problem details, which is like ASP.NET Core's default like API error mechanism, which is kind of like a web standard as well.
Yeah.
So this talk was not found. And here you can see as well, like, hey, you can either get a 200 OK or 404 not found. So this is like the nice thing with Swagger UI. And what this looks like under the hood is when we look at our OpenAPI information, that simple line of code in Program CS basically got us all of this. So the OpenAPI version is 3.0. There's some information about the API. There's a path, API/talks, which is a get endpoint. There's an operation ID, and then there's responses. So response 200, and this will return several content types with Swashbuckle. I don't really like Swashbuckle. I prefer nswag because this is just noise to me.
Yeah.
Like the only thing you honestly care about are like one or these two.
Yeah.
And you can see that this will then return JSON with an array of talk models. And now we can go down to the talk model components, which is basically like the area in an OpenAPI document where you store repeatable things. Usually everyone just stores their models there. So here we can see a talk model, and we can see that the ID is required, the length in minutes is required, room name is required, title is required, and then the ID is an integer, the title, and now we see those attributes, right? So the min length, the max length. Here we see that extremely long 640-minute talk again. And as well, what we see, and that's a little bug in Swashbuckle, we see a room name, but it's nullable. And that's quite weird, at least to me, because we didn't define the room name as nullable. In fact, it's a required string, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that it's not like I have something against Swashbuckle. It's just that other packages like NSWAG or Microsoft's version are a little bit more accurate. Because what Swashbuckle wants you to do is it wants you to use the required property, which made a whole lot of sense. And do you guys know on top of your head, the $1 million question, when was the required keyword added to C#? Was that C# 8 or 9?
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
No
Probably.
idea, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But to modern C# developers, this makes sense. But Swashbuckle still expects you to use the required keyword, which is what you did in the past.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, so this is basically a little application. We just use a couple of attributes, produces response types. We use some analyzers. We add a couple of lines of code to program.cs, and boom, OpenAPI information. We can now load this into NSWAG Studio, into Microsoft Kyoto, like API client generators, and get a whole lot of benefit from them. Any questions from the co-host so far?
No, that's pretty clear. And one of the things that I also would like to add, because you have lots of tools for working with this OpenAPI spec, but also I do a lot of API management, right? And if you have an API that you want to expose through an API gateway, whether it's API management or some other tool, they all have an import for OpenAPI spec. So that's also very convenient if you want to publish some of these APIs. So that's also 100% nice of this standard.
Exactly, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So then let me go back to my Visual Studio.
Maybe one question still, because you now generate your OpenAPI spec. Is that still also your preferred way of working with this? Because I also see teams that either want to or they must, because they were told by their architect or lead dev to do OpenAPI spec first. I really hate that, but is that something that you would also do? Or do you say, okay, I have this tooling, so let me just generate it and write the API first?
Right. So yeah, exactly. There's basically two people in the world, like two types of people in the world, or three maybe. The first one say, no, I want to generate, it's by my code. The second type of people want to be OpenAPI first, and the third people confuse it with OpenAI.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I'm the type of person that wants to generate it with code. I get the point of saying, hey, if we are able to write an API definition in OpenAPI and then implement it, anyone can understand it. So anyone can create an OpenAPI definition, and then the language of choice, the framework of choice is simply an API, like an implementation detail, which is really cool. Yeah. The idea of maybe an OpenAPI definition, and then you generate the server, and then tomorrow we can do Java, today we do .NET, and the next day we do Go.
Yeah.
Like the TypeScript compiler. Sorry. Anyway, to me, that doesn't
whole different rabbit hole.
Exactly. Let's not go into this. To me, that doesn't really work. The problem for me is that server generation with OpenAPI is not always clean, because when we're talking about a server, we're talking about a controller endpoint. We're talking about typical .NET architecture with a controller, a service, and a repo, EF core underneath. That is not going to be generated cleanly by some tool.
Yep.
So then we're going to have to write it by hand. And if we're going to write an OpenAPI spec by hand, and then we're writing the server by hand, we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
There is tooling available that can, you could maybe output an OpenAPI document in your server and then compare it to the original and then use tooling in your pipeline. Yeah. But at that point, to me, it's just easier to just make sure that your OpenAPI is correct, and then just generate it on the server.
Yeah, and it's always in sync, right? You don't have to do anything to keep it in sync because it's generated from the actual API code. So
exactly. The only problem you can have is where the OpenAPI document is not correct, because a lot of people don't know about OpenAPI, or they only care about Swagger UI. So the finer details, like maybe getting some of these properties or getting some specific endpoints or like response codes, if they are missing, they don't care. Yeah. But then if I want to generate an API client, to me, when an OpenAPI document is not 100% correct, it's immediately useless, because then I cannot use it for API client generation anymore.
Oh, it's actually a contract, so it needs to have all the details in there. Yeah.
Exactly what I think. Yes. Okay. Any more questions or thoughts? Whatever. Awesome. So now this was all .NET 8, right? That's not why we're here. We're here to talk about .NET 9. So let's go ahead and do so. So in .NET 9, it is actually quite simple to get started. So we can use .NET New Web API. You can use .NET New Web API AOT, which is something I added for .NET 10. And then this will include the Microsoft's version of OpenAPI for you. So here you can see package reference, Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI. I'm currently using version 901. I think 902 is already available. And as a replacement for Swashbuckle, I installed Scalar. So this is just one package interest, package reference, and now we can get a really cool package back. So then you might be thinking, oh, it's going to be really complicated to use Microsoft's version, and not at all. In fact, it's actually easier. So looking at the code, we can add OpenAPI, and then we call map OpenAPI. Okay. And then for Scalar, we do map Scalar API reference. And this is all you need to do to get started with Microsoft's OpenAPI.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really clean. I also noticed you don't need to add the API Endpoint Explorer anymore.
Exactly. I'm pretty sure that is done under the hood.
Yeah.
There you go. Add OpenAPI Core is somewhere called, and that adds it for you. But yeah, it's just a small single detail. Yeah. I just think it's clean.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
We'll talk about this a little bit more later if we have time. But here you can add transformers, create document names, specify the version you want to use, so like OpenAPI version 2 or 3, that kind of thing. Awesome. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about some differences between .NET 8 and .NET 9, because you talked about migrating. So one of these migration pieces are probably like your schema transformers and the way OpenAPI generates documents, but also maybe how you decorate your endpoints. So here we can see gone are the days of using XML comments in .NET 9. And I think a lot of people skip over .NET 9 and just wait for .NET 10, so this is not going to affect them. But here we see endpoint summary and description properties instead of XML comments.
Yep.
And then what we see as well is something that we have to do for Swashbuckle and for Microsoft's version is to set up a name property. Do you guys do this religiously? Do you always add a name to each endpoint?
Nope.
I do, actually. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. So I think that's just like a Sander thing, right? That's very good.
Apparently.
Exactly. So
I always have only one operation, so it doesn't need a name. It's just the one.
You just name it, this is the one.
This is the one.
This is the one. Do everything.
I do not want to use your OpenAPI documents.
It's very simple and clean.
Super clean. Kiss.
That's true. You can just shout kiss at everything nowadays. Like anyone has a good argument. No, kiss. All right.
Yeah, but this is a good practice to do. So yeah.
And I mean, yes, it is a good practice, I guess, to add a name, but nswag, what the name is useful for the operation ID, and an operation ID is added to each OpenAPI operation as a unique identifier. For example, this is really useful for API client generators to determine what the method name should be. So if like nswag, you can define it to say, hey, I want a talks client with a method create talk. But nswag is really smart and says, hey, there's already a method called create talk. That's going to be the operation ID. I don't like having to set up the name when it's already there in the method name, because it's just busy work for me. I prefer nswag's way. In any case, I'm not sure.
Especially when you change the method name and you don't change the attributes. Yeah.
Actually, maybe you could do then something crazy, right? You could do something like, I'm not sure if you can do this here, but you could do like some stupid name of thing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you can do that.
Or just remove.
That's actually the way I do it.
Well, see, it works, but then, why do we need to do this busy work if it's already there?
Yeah, I agree.
I know. I should talk to the team about that. That's anyway. I'm interesting why they did that. For like minimal APIs, I get it, but for controllers,
I
don't know. So that's one change that you need to do for every endpoint. And then we're going to talk about, just with that little change, like XML comments, operation IDs, but the change in your OpenAPI document, there's going to be some changes. So here we see servers. We now have a new servers property, and it will automatically add the local host to the servers list, which is really useful. I always fill this in all of my OpenAPI documents with like local, test, and prod. So if anyone ever gets access to my OpenAPI document, they also know, where to go to talk to the test environment or prod. So there's no need to Slack me or send me a Teams message about it. It's just nice and easy for other people. And then we see a little change in the talk model as well. So here we can now see that the room name no longer is nullable. That's just because .NET 9 sees, Microsoft's property sees, hey, it is required. So, it's not going to be nullable. It has to be set. Just little things that help, because setting a required attribute on required properties is just a little bit of busy work that you shouldn't have to do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so let's take a little look at .NET 9. And so this is the document, but I first want to make you look at this instead. So this is Scalar, and Scalar is already really cool because it allows you to have a dark mode and a light mode. Amazing.
Nice.
Exactly. So it's kind of similar, maybe a little bit, to Redocly, if you've ever used something like that. It's another alternative to Swagger UI. But Scalar has a lot of options as well. So here we see our endpoints, API/talks. There's a little bit of information about it. There's some information about the libraries it can use. And now we can go ahead and take a look at this endpoint, API/talks. You can see it has the responses 200 OK and a default. And the cool thing about this is that you can select loads of different languages. Let's just do jQuery. And then go ahead and, this is how you would perform the call in jQuery.
Nice.
Cool. That's just a little nice thingy that Scalar gives you. Of course, I prefer to generate an API client, but I still think this is a really nice, worthwhile addition, especially if you're new to a language.
Yeah.
And now we can test the request. We can set authentication, cookies, headers, query parameters, send a request, and then there's the response, like in Swagger UI.
Nice.
And we can also open the API client, and this goes to the Scalar's website. And Scalar has loads of features as well. I believe it even has the same thing with Redocly. It has a tool for validating OpenAPI documents. So you can, in a pipeline, say, hey, this PR is going to fail because the API does not match our rules.
Cool.
And that's stuff I think you can do with Scalar as well, which is really, really useful. And here we can just see, to me, it's a little bit more of a nicer UI. We can create a talk. Here we have the request body for the talk, the name of the room where the talk will take place. Let's take a look at how we would do this in HTTP client in C#. That's just nice. It's very good. Okay. Any questions about .NET 9 so far, before I talk a little bit more about specific changes and features?
No, not for me. It's quite clear.
No, this looks really great.
Really
I'm
nice.
going to try this instead of Swissbuckle.
Yeah.
Exactly. You should. Yeah, definitely. So the next thing I quickly want to talk about is, Microsoft created their own package, and Microsoft is also really, really big on ahead of time compilation. Are you guys familiar with that?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes. The AOT.
Okay. Exactly. So for the people that might not be familiar, so C# usually or has always been like a JIT compiled language, just in time, where the code is compiled to some common intermediate language, that's the correct name, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And then at runtime, the code will be translated to machine code for the specific OS you're running on. And that makes it so that C#, just like Java, can run on several OSs. Where AOT, ahead of time compilation, means that when you build the code, it is immediately compiled to machine code. The benefit here is that you no longer need to ship like a runtime with your application. So your application will start up faster, it will require a little bit less memory because it doesn't need to have a long runtime. It will require a little bit less space as well, I believe. And yeah, that's really, really cool. There's some downsides as well for like no use of reflection and some other nasty thingies that can be kind of painful. Like EF Core 9 has experimental support for it. And .NET 10, it will have full support. But there's still issues that you can still have. But it is definitely worthwhile if you're using like microservices and stuff like that. So why am I talking about this? That's because in .NET 9 and ASP.NET Core's OpenAPI package, this is now all integrated. Let me have a look at AOT here. There we go. So if you now were to run .NET New Web API AOT, and you were to do this in .NET 10, you would already get the package integrated. Otherwise, you'd need to install it. But there's a little change in the program CS to get ahead of time compilation working. So there's things like we're using some serialization options with an app JSON serialization context. Don't really ask me what this all means under the hood. But basically, JSON is something, deserialization and serialization are done with reflection, and that does not really support it. So this is using source generators with these types to then source generate the serialization logic for you. So it's a lot more performant as well. So here we see some changes, and we don't really see any changes to the OpenAPI logic. And
I guess this is also more performant, even if you're not using ahead of time compilation.
Exactly.
Just using the source generator in general.
A lot more performant. Exactly. It's something you could drop into your applications just today and get those benefits. Yeah. Okay. Right. I talked about showing off a little bit of minimal API endpoints, and I haven't even done that yet. Okay. So let's take a look. So map talk endpoints. So here we're taking a look at some minimal API and OpenAPI. It's really similar. Here we can see we map a method called getTalks, and we set the with name for the operation ID. Let's talk about something more interesting, like the getTalk, for example, where we use producer's response type with controllers, which is also possible with minimal APIs. You're recommended to use this results like union type kind of thing, where we can now say, hey, when we go to API/talk/ID, we now launch into this function that results either a OK talk model or a not found. And then the code is very similar. We return a typed result not found or an OK with the talk. That's basically it. And below you can see the create talk with the the OK, the validation problem, the conflict, just like we did in the controller.
Okay, and that's enough to get all the metadata. So for instance, on line 22, right, where you did define the endpoint.
Yeah.
It's also possible to do a .producer's response, right?
Exactly. You can do this. So here you can go ahead and say such things. This is not really recommended by the team. So the team, that's kind of interesting to say actually. So in .NET 10, I made some changes, and we'll talk about more of that later if we have time. I made some changes to the producer's response type to add the description property. But the team prefers to not use attributes. They prefer to, if you use attributes, they prefer you to use the extension methods because they're a little bit more flexible.
Yeah.
But they actually prefer you to use this because this actually gives you the compile time safety. Where if we now were to return something like type results, let's say conflict or something like that, I believe maybe it should, there you go. Here, now it's already going to say like, hey, you're returning a conflict, but that's not what this method is returning. Now we're getting an actual compile time error, which you wouldn't get if you would use the producer's extension.
And this gives enough metadata for the OpenAPI document to have all the fields filled in the way you want. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And .NET 9 also has transformers, so we can have like that's actually, the .NET 9 has global transformers. .NET 10 is actually going to get like local transformers. So we could have, I think, with OpenAPI Transformer, and then you could also enrich OpenAPI endpoints information per endpoint. All right.
Good stuff.
Exactly. Do we have some more time for some more demos?
Sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So in the second part, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about customizing OpenAPI and doing things like build time generation. So let's talk a little bit about build time generation first. So why would you want to use this? So currently, how do you guys do this? Because I think you guys probably do the same thing as me, where I want to have the OpenAPI document to insert it into some tool. So I launch my application, I go to swagger/swagger.json or something like that, and then grab the file and then insert it and then close my application again.
Yeah, it's a fully human automated process. Yeah,
exactly.
Human in the loop.
Yeah, exactly. So build time means, well, what it says. So when we build the application, the documents should, be generated and stored on the disk.
Nice.
So this was already technically supported before with Swashbuckle and NSWAG, but it's now a little bit more officially supported with Microsoft's own package as well. The way it works is actually quite funny. So what you need to do to get this to work is you need to install Microsoft Extensions API Description Server, and that's all you need to do. So now you can have the OpenAPI documents directory. You can have OpenAPI generate document options to say like, hey, I want a different file name, or where should it store the file? And then you can customize a couple of things. So how do you guys think this works under the hood? So you're probably thinking, they might actually like analyze the assembly and then find the endpoints and etc. But there's the problem where you can have conditional logic as well. Like in your OpenAPI pipeline, you could do if statements on the date or whatever, and then generate different documents. So that's not possible. Yeah. So what is happening is when you do .NET build, let me clear this. When you say .NET build, it will actually secretly start up your application with a mock server behind it.
Oh, wow.
Go to OpenAPI/v1.json, grab the file, store it on the disk, and exit the server, and then continue the build process.
Yeah. So it makes sure that the whole pipeline, the whole OpenAPI pipeline is run.
Yeah. I thought that's so silly. Like it's just like it's like an internal solution to the problem.
Yeah, it feels really heavy-handed, but
you have to do it.
You have to do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
You can't simply ignore the conditional logic. So yeah.
Precisely. So in .NET 10, what's going to change is that I think they're going to kind of include all of this logic into this package itself, because this package was basically built for Swashbuckle and NSWAG, and it's a bit of like duct tape and dreams that it works for Microsoft's version as well. So yeah, that's really useful. So now we can have the OpenAPI spec in our repo, and you can do really useful things with it. So you can include it in your PRs, and other teams can have a look. Other JavaScript teams can have a look at my PR and say, hey, this OpenAPI document is not what we expected. They don't need to actually know C# anymore. And you can also include it in your pipeline and use tools to validate your OpenAPI definition. You could write policies, like every endpoint needs to be like, how do you say that? API/users instead of API/user.
Plural. Yeah.
Plural. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So those are things I don't see a lot of people using. I've not really used it in enterprise projects myself, but I really want to create a talk about this as well, because setting like organization-wide API rules, for example, every endpoint needs to have like a security definition, is very important for security.
Yeah, and we all know that documenting that will not make every developer do it. So we need some way to check it.
Exactly what it is. Yeah. So I think that's something that it's kind of there's
pretty
a whole
stuff.
market there that someone can fill. Yeah.
Nice.
Okay. So then the second thing that I can still talk about is customizing your OpenAPI documents. So here we have a need to maybe change a couple of things. For example, we want to change the version, right? We want to change the version to version 3 instead of version 2 or whatever. In .NET 10, we're going to get a different OpenAPI version. So we're going to get OpenAPI 3.1 by default instead. But then we can also add transformers. And this is really interesting. So transformers are useful to transform the OpenAPI document that's generated. So we can add a document transformer for the entire document, and we can say, add some contact information. Let me move my mouse here. Because this is not information it can grab from endpoints, right? This is metadata that you have to add like this. You can also add operation transformers, and you could also use generics. You can use delegates, and you can also just create classes yourself. So we could always also add an operation transformer that would say, I want to transform an operation. So every operation, every endpoint will get a 500 internal server error by default. Maybe this is something that you don't want to have to add an explicit attribute or produces or results to each endpoint.
Yeah, or maybe if you've got a global exception handler or something like that.
Exactly, something like that. Then this can be really, really useful. And finally, you can also have schema transformers. And schema, I always found a little bit of a weird word, but we're basically talking about models here. So all of your API models. And this is a very specific model that they also use as an example. So if the type is a decimal, like the weather forecast or an amount somewhere, whatever, then we also want it as a decimal. Because I think by default, OpenAPI makes a decimal a double. And here you can just set the format. And it's basically, it's kind of a loose type. You can also make this dotnetFlix, and it will just compile, I believe. It will actually, no, that's my word, that's my C spell extension. But it's
you should add it to your dictionary.
I'll add it to the dictionary. I got you. There you go.
Machine-wide.
There we go. Done it.
Internet-wide. Cool. Thanks.
So these are really, really powerful. And I'm currently thinking of, I'm working on for .NET 10 to create a package with some very useful transformers that people can just download. So I'm also looking for community feedback, like, hey, what are things that you're always doing in OpenAPI, and how can we make this easy? Okay.
Cool.
Exactly. That's demo 2. And I think at that point I've had loads of, shown all the code. Are there, from an observer perspective, like from you guys, what would you still like to see, or do you have any questions?
Don't have any questions at the moment. It's very, very clear demos. What's the most, what's on top of your wish list for .NET 10?
What's on top of my wish list?
Yeah.
So,
and let's scope that to OpenAPI spec.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good question as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a little silly because the things that are on top of my wish list are already implemented. But then let's just talk as if they were not implemented yet for .NET 10. So I was talking to the ASP.NET Core team, and these transformers are really, really useful. But the thing is that they are global. So if you would want to only add this to like endpoints that are, I don't know, public or some other definition, you would need to do like a switch case here. Like if operation .name, or you can get the context and you can like find the specific endpoints. It's going to be a really ugly method with switch cases and everything. So I told the team, I want to be able to put these operations or these transformers on endpoints themselves.
Yeah, right.
And that's what I already talked about a little earlier. So we could go ahead in .NET 10 and say, I'm not sure what the syntax is on top of my head, but like with OpenAPI Transformer, something like that. And then we can here define some code. So why I find that so useful is the second thing that I would really like. So in .NET 10, I've added the ability to, let's go to the controllers again. There was a bit of a problem for me. You can say, this endpoint, create talk, will return a 409 conflict. That's good to know. But usually when I'm, for example, using someone's API, I want to know why and when.
Right.
Because that's very useful information. But I don't see that here. So OpenAPI has a description property, but there was no description. It was not possible to set a description on such an attribute. It was possible with XML comments, but then you had some more issues. So now what is going to be in .NET 10, which is something I added, is where you can add a description. This error is returned when the talk already exists, something like that.
Yeah.
And I will always recommend people like, hey, set this description when it's a very specific domain. So when people will be like, oh, this is really difficult to understand, when will they get this information? It also make it easier for the client to set up like a good error flow.
Cool.
Exactly. And this is then something that they didn't want to implement the minimal APIs. They didn't want to add, or it's not possible to add a new property to the producers method, because there's a params string at the end. So you can't add another string at the end of this.
Yeah.
So this is now where I want to use this local with OpenAPI Transformer. So I can set it that way.
Makes sense.
Awesome. So those are kind of the things I'm really looking forward to. Yeah.
So I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Did you have another slide that you wanted to show? I think.
Let me have a quick look. If you just give me some time to take a look at my screen, so maybe you want to switch back to a different camera view.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, let me have a quick look if there's anything important still to share.
Yeah, we don't want to share any of your passwords and stuff.
No, that'll be okay. So I have two more quick slides, and then I'm done. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Cool.
Let's go.
So I've talked about a lot of these already. So the future of OpenAPI in .NET 10. So .NET 10 is going to be the new LTS, and there's going to be a lot of OpenAPI features in there, right? So my PRs, like I said, the producer's response type with the description, the local transformers, which was my idea, but I haven't built it. That's all Savia. The AOT template for ASP.NET Core will include OpenAPI by default. I added some bugs, and I also PRs that fix those bugs. Have to be honest. Still working on another bug fix. Sorry.
Makes you feel alive.
It makes you feel alive.
We all do it.
Exactly. XML comment support. It's currently already been merged for .NET 10, so that's coming. OpenAPI version 3.1 is a different OpenAPI version. That's actually going to be the default in .NET 10. It's actually quite a breaking change versus OpenAPI 3. That's why it's also not super popular compared to OpenAPI 3, but it's going to be the standard for .NET.
Okay.
Better build time generation, and some other features like YAML support, bug fixes, etc. And then finally, should you migrate? Right? So my opinion on this matter is like, if you are working on an application and you want to create an AOT compatible application, so ahead of time compilation, then you have to use this, because this NSWAG and Swashbuckle are not AOT compatible. And if you're maybe creating a whole new .NET project, I would definitely say start out with .NET 9's version, because it's just going to be really, really useful. It's .NET 10 is just around the corner, so there's nothing to lose. And yeah, it's just also faster. The performance is better than the other packages. But if you're already in a really big repo, you're using NSWAG or Swashbuckle, and you're happy, and you have lots of custom code for it, I don't really see a reason to migrate. So both community packages are still well maintained. Microsoft talked to those community leaders for those packages to set up their own package. There's a really healthy communication going on, and it's completely fine to keep using NSWAG, to keep using Swashbuckle. There's nothing wrong with the packages, and they will live for very many years. Yeah. So that's kind of how I think about it.
That's good to know.
Yeah, you could even introduce, like we almost called it the Boy Scout rule, right? If you do a big change in one of your services, for instance, then you could, include a migration to the new packages. But it is, like you said, it's not really necessary, and there's no real time pressure for that, right? So
exactly.
Cool.
That's about that's all I have to share on the topic.
Awesome.
So if there's any more questions, let me know. And otherwise, I'm really, really happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
I think this was a really clear talk, Sander. Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Awesome.
I would say let's schedule another one in a year's time when we have .NET 10 officially released, and then we can look at what's coming in .NET 11. That would be fun.
Oh, that sounds fun. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, so let's after the show, let's take out our agendas and let's make it final. So thanks so much to those watching. If you like the episodes, please like it. Please subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a lot. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.